Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm doing week 24 of my 2020 reads. This week I read a number of queer books, so that makes me very pleased, as well as finished a buddy read, DNF'd a book as well, and then also at the end of this video I do want to talk a little bit about just some reflections on allyship based on a lot of the discussions that have been happening in Booktube recently that have kind of popped into my mind and I wanted to share. So first this week, I finished Bloom by Kevin Panetta, illustrated by Savanna Ganucheau. This is a YA contemporary graphic novel that is a queer love story. It is about Ari, who is a teenager who wants to leave for the big city, but before he does so over the summer, he needs to train a new person to take over his role, helping out at his parents' bakery, and for this he hires Hector, who maybe they fall in love. So much of this story is really gorgeous and sweet. It takes place in a bakery. There's like a ton of scenes of actual baking that are just beautiful. The artwork in this is just stunning. It is so sweet and so beautiful. I love the curved lines and just how gorgeous all of the artwork is. The story itself though, and especially the characters, I did have some problems with. So the main character, Ari, is 18 and he is kind of problematic in a lot of ways. So this story really is about his growth, about him blooming, about him growing and becoming a better person. But for maybe 95% of the story, he's kind of immature and self-centered and whiny and often really kind of inconsiderate and even cruel to other people. And although there is sort of a redemption arc for him, I really struggled because so much of the story involved him just being not the best. I also kind of had some issues with the romance, so it's very hard for me to fully get into a romantic story if I can't get behind the romance, and that happened here. Hector, the guy who comes in to help out at the bakery, is just the sweetest. I adore Hector so much. He is so kind and so generous and so considerate and so helpful. And I can't help but feeling that his relationship with Ari was an unhealthy one, because I really think that Ari sort of takes advantage of Hector in this story. And even though a lot of this is about Ari learning and growing and becoming a better person, I can't help but think that if I was Hector's friend, I would really want him to not be in that relationship because I don't think that it was a very healthy one. So I struggled with that relationship. I struggled with Ari's character, and I think there is definitely a lot to say about having a story about growth, but I think that this week I just really needed something comforting, and this wasn't that. So it could just also be a misalignment with what I was in the mood for and what I thought this story would be versus what it actually was. So for me, I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. I did think that the artwork was absolutely fantastic, and the story really might work for a lot of other people. It just didn't work for me, at least this week. Next, I finished another queer graphic novel, which was Bingo Love by T. Franklin, illustrated by Jenn St-Onge and colored by Joyce San. So this is a story of 2 women who meet in, I think, maybe the 60s when they are young teenagers. They go to the same school. They become best friends and they fall in love, but their relationship is very much not acceptable by their families, and so they're separated, only to lead very separate lives until when they're old and they meet at a bingo hall again, and they realize that, you know, they were missing out in all of those years. So there's a lot about this story that is just gorgeous. The artwork is fantastic. I love the artwork. Again, there's a lot of roundedness in this. The colors are really, really stunning. There's also just a lot of fashion in this that I liked. So there's so much beautiful artwork, so many beautiful colors. The story itself is really one of women who are forced into lives that's not what they were looking for. That's not who they were, forced by the strictures of society and kind of coming together and realizing that they should be together. So there's a lot of love in this story. However, I did struggle a little bit with the drama in the story. There is very rightfully so a lot of drama in what happens when they're separated and when they have to lead these lives that are just not the right fit for them. And then when they reconnect, there's a lot of pushback still, even though this happens much later. I think maybe in the 2000s or 2010s, it happens much later, but it is still very hard for them to lead a life together because of all of the pushback of their families still. And that kind of drama, again, it just felt a little overwhelming for me, and I don't know if that was because this week I really needed something sweet and gentle, and again, I thought that was what I was getting, and it was just a little bit more intense than that. So I'm having a rough time rating things this week because I'm rating based on how I felt reading it this week, but I just wonder if it would be different if I read it another week. In any case, I gave it 3.5 out of 5 stars. I do think this is really worth picking up, but it is just a little bit more dramatic rather than sweet, and there's a lot of riled up emotions and difficult arguments and conversations that happen in it. The next book that I finished, though, really worked for me, which was Clap When You Land by Elizabeth Acevedo. I absolutely adored this book. I actually have done a standalone review, so that'll come out later this week if you want to know more about all of the very many reasons why I loved this book. But this is just so perfect. It is a YA contemporary told in verse about two sisters, Camino and Yahaira, who live respectively in the Dominican Republic and New York, and they don't know about each other. They're half sisters, and they discover this when their father dies in a plane crash when he's traveling between New York and the Dominican Republic, and they have to process this grief over his loss, as well as a lot of anger and difficulty with uncovering all of these secrets of his kind of double life and building a relationship together. It is stunning. It is beautifully written. It is so emotionally powerful. The representation in here is great. Oh, and it counts for Queer Pride Month. This is so amazing. I actually have been wanting to read this book forever, but I decided to just bump it up on my TBR when I saw Fadwa at Word Wonders, who I will link below. Actually, I'll link the video below. She did a queer lit recommendations video, and I saw this on it, and I was so surprised. I didn't realize that this had queer representation in it, but one of the two characters, Yahaira, is queer, and she has a girlfriend, and that's just, it's actually a very lovely part of the story. So I was so happy to read this book. It moved me. I really loved it. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and if you are somebody who's read anything else by Acevedo and you've liked it, read this one. It's fantastic. And the last book that I finished this week was another one that really worked for my mood, which was Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen. This is a book that I buddy read with Mariana at Mariana Quesada, who I will link below. We are both trying to finish all of Jane Austen's works, and it was so much fun to buddy read this together. I love discussing it with her. She's really fantastic. If you haven't checked out her channel before, please do. She does BookTube in Spanish, but everything has English subtitles, so really check her out. She's so much fun. But this book was really fascinating. So this is apparently the first novel that Jane Austen wrote, even though it wasn't published for a little while, and it's a satire. It's very funny. Jane Austen has so much biting humor. If you've never read her before, it's really quite witty. And this book is a satire of Gothic novels, so novels where, you know, there's a young woman who goes to a mysterious mansion and it's very creepy and she has to uncover things. It's very much a satire of that, but it's also just a satire of society, and I loved those satirical elements. The book starts off talking about how, you know, the girl that we're following, Catherine, she's very disappointing as a heroine. It's like her mother didn't die in childbirth, she wasn't locked up at home, you know, she wasn't precocious, all of these sorts of things, and it's just this really funny satire poking at a lot of the common things that are done in Gothic novels. But it also has a deeper satire of a lot of aspects of society. It was so funny. There was a guy in this that is just, you know, we can see portrayals like him in a lot of modern things where he's just so full of himself, he's constantly mansplaining to the main character, all these sorts of things. It made me a little sad to realize that that's still so relevant, that it's still such an issue, but it was very funny to read about. I think that the second half of the book worked a little bit less well for me than the first half, even though the second half is when they actually get to Northanger Abbey and all the the Gothic things. But I found that as is apparently the case for me, I really struggled with the romance in this. There's a romantic interest, and I found him not very likable, very arrogant and condescending, and I didn't kind of like that relationship. I also had this similar issue with a previous Jane Austen book that I read earlier this year, Persuasion, so I just wonder if that's kind of the type of hero that Jane Austen writes, and that I'm just more sensitive to it now than I was when I was younger and read some of her other works. I'm not really sure, but that was kind of problematic for me. Also, just kind of slowed down, I felt, in the second half, but I did just really like a lot of the satire, a lot of the social commentary, and I also liked some of the commentary on what we should be afraid on in life. So much of this is making fun of Gothic novels where you are expecting ghosts and, you know, mysterious wives locked up in attics and these sorts of things, when really a lot of the bad things in life are just kind of the faults of human nature, and I liked that social commentary. So overall, I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I don't think it's Jane Austen's strongest novel, but I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. So in addition to the books that I finished this week, I did DNF one book, which was Mangoes and Mistletoe by Adriana Herrera. This is a short little romance contemporary novella that I was very interested in because it is queer. It's a female-female relationship, and I've heard very good things about Adriana Herrera. This story takes place in Scotland, in a castle where 2 women who live in the US but both are of Dominican heritage go for a baking competition and they get paired up. So I thought, oh, I'm gonna love this. I love, you know, Great British Baking Show. I love all of this sort of stuff. But again, I think maybe my mood was a little difficult this week and I had some issues with the relationship. So I ended up DNFing this at 25% after a couple of scenes where I felt there were issues with respecting boundaries and consent. One of the main characters is very grumpy. The other character is very outgoing, and the outgoing character I felt really was not respecting the boundaries of the grumpy character. She kept pushing and doing things that I felt really were not acceptable. And I think that this also could be affected not just by my general mood this week, but by the fact that I am currently in the middle of buddy reading Not That Bad, edited by Roxane Gay with another booktuber, Cynthia from BookWhimsy, who I will link below. And so much of that book is talking about rape culture and about the ways that we don't value women's consent and their kind of bodily autonomy and all sorts of things. And so I'm like really sensitive to that right now, apparently. So I did DNF it because that was just getting to me. And I didn't really feel like I could get behind the relationship. But I think also that I was just really sensitive to it this week. And maybe if I had read it at another time, it would be different. I'm not super sure. If anybody has read other Adriana Herrera books, I'd really like to know in the comments below if you have seen anything like that of, you know, not respecting boundaries or not respecting consent, because I have a lot of Adriana Herrera books on my TBR that I want to read, and I just would love to know if this is kind of like an outlier or if that's something that is maybe an issue in some of the other books, just to know if that's something that I should go into or not. So that wraps up all of my reads for this week. If you have read any of these, or you have any comments or any thoughts or any recommendations, anything at all, I'd love to hear anything you have to say. Go ahead and leave it down in a comment below. The other thing that I wanted to do was just have a quick little chat talking about some of my reflections on allyship on BookTube. So there have been so many amazing videos that people have been putting out, really talking about their experiences being booktubers of color or about kind of their reflections on being an ally and kind of what that means and how they can be better. And I really love all of these discussions. It's made me really think and really reflect on my own practices and realize that there's some places that I still need to grow quite a bit. So in particular, there were a couple of videos, notably by Kesara Reads and the Artisan, Geek and Bookish realm, all of which I will link below, that talked about the way that allyship is done on BookTube and how it could be better. In particular, talking about how sometimes the way that white booktubers try to be allies can feel very performative and very tokenizing, really focusing on subscribing to booktubers or shouting out booktubers simply because of their marginalization rather than because of their content. And that can feel very devaluing because these are content creators. They work hard on their content. They love books. They want to talk about books, and that's what they want to be recognized for, not just simply the fact that they happen to belong to a particular group. And I realized that I fall into this. I definitely do. And it was very oblivious of me to not realize it, but I'm glad that people have had this discussion and really brought that to light. So in particular, I do monthly priorities, and this is something I've done for the past year and a half. I absolutely love each month focusing in on a specific marginalization or a specific topic and really reading a ton of books within that kind of let me hear that voice and amplify it and get me to really consider what's going on. I found last year that so many of the books that I was reading were things that I'd heard about from Own Voices channel. So this year I thought, let me add in shout outs to my monthly priorities of booktubers who are Own Voices for whatever that marginalization is. And I completely missed the fact that that could be harmful, that could be hurtful for those booktubers, because it would be them being shouted out for their marginalization rather than for their content, even if everybody that I've shouted out are booktubers whose content I adore, and that's really why I love their channels. And even if it wasn't intentional, it was still a very misguided thing. So I definitely want to apologize to anybody that I've shouted out if that felt devaluing. I really want to say that I do value you. Everybody that I have shouted out is amazing. They are truly amazing content creators. They talk about books that fascinate me and they have great analysis, but it was harmful and hurtful to do that, and I'm very sorry. So going forward, I won't do shout outs anymore as part of my monthly priorities, but I was talking about this over the weekend with Sush quite a bit, and he had the idea that, hey, just make more time in your BookTube filming schedule to do just dedicated shout out videos based on content. And I think that makes so much sense. I mean, this is the thing, people do it all the time. I've done it before. And I just want to make sure that I am recognizing channels and giving more kind of screen time to these wonderful content creators that I love, but doing it in a way that really focuses on their content. So I think maybe, maybe I'll do a video about the SFF creators that I love, or the middle grade readers that I love, or people who do excellent vlogs, or who have really soothing voices, these sorts of things, the reasons why I'm subscribed to the channels. So I'm gonna try to add in more shout out videos that just are just standalone shout outs, maybe something like once a quarter or something. I'll add in a video about that. But yeah, it was definitely a little bit of a realization that I totally have contributed to the problem, and it's a learning experience. I really appreciate everybody who has spoken out about what they see going on in the community. I know that so many booktubers have said this, but it is not the obligation of booktubers of color to educate white booktubers about what they're doing wrong. But when they take the time to educate us, I think we should listen to what they're saying and appreciate that they're going to kind of all this pain and expensive time and effort to share those thoughts. So I appreciate all of that work that they have done, and I will try to do more work on my part and learn to be a better BookTube community member. So yeah, if anybody has any thoughts or any comments or questions about this topic, or any recommendations for specific kind of topics of BookTube shout out videos that you'd like to see, I'd love to hear it down below in the comments. So yeah, here's to keeping growing as a reader, as a BookTube community member, and as a reviewer.